Experiences of banishment. They have black flags of hope and melancholy as their dancing partner. They have knives to cut the bread of friendship and blood to clean the dirt away. Leo Ferre, The Anarchists. I have had occasion to experience some kind of banishment for short periods of time, life in hiding, prison, and expulsion. Even if they all are conditions that are imposed by repression, each one is very different from the other. I'm going to talk about them as they are experiments in freedom. However, I intend to expose the thoughts that these circumstances raised in me, rather than describe their practical aspects. I'm going to take into consideration the inner dimension involved, then I'll try to draw some general conclusions. This is the way I prefer. In fact, as concerns the many events I experienced, I tend to remember the ideas and emotional states that characterize them. I'm going to use narrative, articulated discussion, and short notes. I'm sometimes going to quote other people's words, but only because these words had a decisive importance for me on these occasions. And only some distant echo in the reader's own experience will allow him to distinguish these notes from a mere literary exercise. My most extreme experience doesn't concern fear or the privation of freedom. In one of his First World War poems, the poet Ungaretti writes that one day he felt as though he was docile as a fiber in the universe. The poet, however, uses this expression to say that he thought he was part of the universe, whereas my experience was shocking and bewildering. I remember Ungaretti's words coming into my mind as the most appropriate. When your heart throbs, certain correspondences of the mind push your ideas into a strange universe called intuition. I proudly changed docile into fragile, and tried to convince myself that the latter was the word the poet actually wrote. But I didn't only feel as if I were fragile, I was also docile. Why? I had got lost in a wood. While looking for a way out, I fell down a cliff. Luckily, my rucksack prevented me from breaking my back, but I was in such pain that I remained motionless on the bed of a dry river for a night and a day. I soon finished my food and water. I spent days trying to climb and find a spot from where to orient myself, and one night in the rain. The fourth day passed, and besides being hungry and very tired, I started to feel a strange interior dizziness. At a certain point, the different aspects of my character started arguing with one another as though they were different people. Their discourses were so realistic that every time I woke up after falling asleep with my legs wrapped around a trunk to avoid falling down, I couldn't say if I had really met someone or if I had just been dreaming. Two voices were the most frequent, the pessimistic one and the optimistic one. The former attacked the awkward ingenuity of the latter with arguments that I will never forget. The quarrel was mainly about the relation between man and nature. The optimistic one interpreted the shapes in the wood, branches of trees, paths between the bushes, etc., as signs of a way out and cheered up. The pessimistic one sneered at this reassuring anthropomorphism as he claimed that a wood didn't give any signs, it just was. But the optimistic one didn't give up. On the contrary, he created deities for himself as companions of travel. It was when I slid on a sloping rock dozens of meters up that I really felt as if I was a docile fiber in the universe. Out of the blue, I realized that freedom is often no more than a question of balance. So many desires, projects, and discussions on the power of the individual transforming his life. A few centimeters further, and everything was finished. I regretted, pathetically, that I wouldn't be able to write anything to the world on whose fragile borders I was still advancing hesitantly. I become strongly convinced that words are medicines. The Greeks intended them as both medicine and poison, that keep us apart from the absolutely other that nature is. Wild nature is not as it is depicted in primitivist illustrated magazines. On the contrary, it is a terrifying place because it is mute, a place of total communion and at the same time of absolute loneliness. Extreme solitude is a medicine too, because it is a relation in which others participate in the form of absence. As I was lying on the rocks of that dry river, I found myself thinking of what my comrades would have said about that circumstance, and I laughed heartily. My comrades. Words as medicine. I experienced my most intense relation with theory the night that I had to light a fire using a book of Hegel. I can't describe my hesitation when I tore out the pages, nor can I describe my thoughts around the fire or the light that Hegel's dialectics assumed in the unusual way it was being used. I realized that, not by chance, Heraclitus the Obscure used to see in the flames of fire the sensitive expression of things becoming reality. Kafka says that logic cannot resist against those who want to stay alive. I decided that each time I talked with certainty about the struggle and radical projects, I would always remember what I felt when I was on that rock. Life with its necessary illusions had always taken me away from awareness of my docility towards the world. In fact, I couldn't have done anything had such awareness been alive. What can we destroy and what can we build if we don't know whether we will be there a moment later or not? While I was in prison or in confinement, I promised myself I would do many things once my imprisonment was over. Of course, it was not so. Life absorbs you and makes you forget the punches you take head-on. But I realized that the sense of vacuity I experienced in that wood has penetrated me like a note that secretly accompanies any affirmation I make. If I were to listen to that rocky demon more often, I would talk much less. Upon those bare rocks, where eagles built their nest, I guessed how strong the thought of committing suicide could be. The idea that you can say goodbye to the world at any time makes life wonderful. Go ahead, dare further, no one can compel you to live. Through the obstinate voice of that demon, we can face any enemy. In fact, all blackmail collapses on the sharp point of this kind of awareness. On the edge of an attractive cliff, in the absolute emptiness where fiction disappears and only what counts really counts, I met unreserved love. In other words, the optimist prevailed with reasons that reason doesn't know. When one night in the rain a kind of cosmic voice, my personal Mephistopheles, proposed a pact to me, I felt an irresistible euphoria. If you renounce your ideas, I will take you out of this wood. I said euphoria, which is what I felt when I refused the offer. Still rhetorical even when he is delirious, some will say. After all, even our hallucinations reveal who we are. It might seem strange, but my experience as someone in clandestinity is all there in the experience I've just told you about. The rest is a series of details. We only really remember what shocks us. As I listened to my various selves arguing in the wood, I understood the meaning of Nietzsche's affirmation that what we call I is only an illusion of grammar, our life being just a space which innumerable entities in conflict pass through. After that, I have often found myself thinking about the concept of identity. What really frightens us is our lack of control over what surrounds us. I am sure that the few days I spent in the woods affected me far more than the months I spent in prison. Everything is, or seems to be, under control in prison. At least it was like that under the conditions that I experienced there. Of course, your freedom is taken away and you hate your jailers, but everything repeats itself in the same way, with you on the one side and them on the other, and you can carry out your minimal project. In other words, there is a code. There is a big difference between the prisoner who absorbs this code until it becomes part of the total institution, and the one who cannot accept it. But even the most determined rebel uses certain codes. On certain occasions, on the contrary, all codes collapse, because nothing, not even our lack of freedom, is sure. I think that lack of all guarantees can lead to insanity. In this sense, I perceived better what a radical critique of psychiatry is. I have often woken up suddenly with a fear of not having water, and in such cases it has always been a great pleasure to find a bottle close to my bed. In contrast, I have hardly ever dreamt about prison. As for the concept of identity, the condition of being in clandestinity is a remarkable experiment on the subject. It can be far more useful than a lot of philosophy books. Corduroy said that we should be able to change our name every day. That is also what I said to the cops when they questioned me, and I added that the concept of identity is authoritarian. The not-so-relaxed reaction of the cops showed me clearly how categories of identity are Dominion's pivotal point. What is identity? A certain image built up, with a number of elements, comes into play in our daily relations. Our past and what others know about us become quite habitual aspects, and we don't usually give them much thought. When we become intimate with someone, we open up to him or her what is most precious to us, affections and ideas that in themselves have a story. A clandestine person, on the contrary, continuously has to create his or her identity, which has to be coherent in order not to be suspicious. To get used to a name that isn't yours is a very particular experience, which might be impossible for someone, maybe because it is very similar to I is Another by a clandestine of poetry called Rimbaud. An interesting and useful aspect of this condition is that it helps you to develop a basic skill, i.e., it teaches you to talk about yourself with extreme sincerity without mentioning any details about your life. It is not so much a capacity for abstraction, but rather the ability to transform your experiences into a distillation of thoughts and emotions. A different concept of identity is maybe what is left over from this process of distillation. In the course of this interior alchemy, you must throw away something important, which can be painful. For example, owing to my character, it was hard for me to renounce the public aspect of my subversive activity. I use the inverted comma because I can't forget a sentence of Valerie's notebooks in which he said that what we call character is something temporary. Surely, a comrade on the run is always thinking of his identity at risk and how to get involved in other comrades' projects. Do they remember me? In this case, coherence, which in social relations is a guarantee of the regularity that shelters us from fear and chaos, and which is often far less obvious than it might seem, assumes a very particular dimension, where the tension between theory and practice is at a more interior level. This coherence can sometimes be reached by paying a high price in the sphere of affections. I chose not to be too rigorous when I had to go clandestine, as proved by the visit police paid me a few months later. But I can guess how one can open or close oneself by paying constant attention. I understand the comrade who says he knew authentic freedom only as a clandestine, when he traveled incognito through countries and people. I had a little taste of this one night on a hill, as I looked at the lights of the towns from the distance of the fugitive. Those who are banned can overturn their condition and become bandits. One's attention, as regards the territory where one moves, one's looks and behaviors and unwanted contact with comrades, cannot be improvised, because it requires the necessary time and energy. But other comrades with more experience than me can explain this much better. Living in hiding and being held in prison are very different conditions, also as regards the perception of one's identity. I remember having felt a deep and almost euphoric joy when from my cell I started writing to my comrades whom I hadn't been in touch with for a long time. I was writing with my name. I was receiving letters and talking about past experiences and future projects. All this filled my heart and days with joy. Comrades talk about prisoners, organize solidarity initiatives, and make public their ideas. Those who live in hiding are even more isolated. Their coherence is proud and difficult as they cannot have an external insight. May the wanderers be remembered. Living in hiding is an experience of strong relations and complicities, but also of great solitude. The demon of nostalgia often visits you and brings you memories that you considered buried. A far-off childhood friend, the smell of the shop where you used to go as a child, a girl you loved when you were a teenager, or maybe the beautiful woman who passed in front of you the day before. And then words, places, songs, everything seems to conspire to make you feel nostalgic. Nostalgia is a strange world, as it can make even a stupid Sanremo song sound sweet to an anarchist. Everybody knows the difference between nostalgia and sadness. The former is a black-colored sensation, but it's a black that gives you something. Have you ever noticed that gloomy people have a distracted and scrupulous kindness of their own? As they are caught by nostalgia for their past, they develop a particular sensibility for unknown people, as if they wanted to fill the emptiness with a promise of happiness. Living in hiding is more or less like that. Ferré's lyrics, which I quoted at the beginning, have just come back into my mind. Curiously enough, I found them written on a wall with a felt-tip pen. It is singular that anarchists are depicted as nostalgic people, isn't it? They have black flags of hope and melancholy as their dancing partner. Well, I think that living in hiding has turned me into this, my irreducible optimism has become more melancholic, as though it were accompanied by a gypsy tune. The homologation of activities and gestures is making all critique more and more inoffensive. We often have the impression that speaking is pointless. Living in hiding and being held in prison were all very different experiences for me from this point of view. In prison, I experienced the power of words. To speak to the guards, director, and staff in a certain way, or to speak to other prisoners during the sociality time. To speak to the guards, director, and staff in a certain way, or to speak to other prisoners during the sociality time, has practical effects. Rebel words are likely to bring about action. Therefore, they are feared. If you are clandestine, the power of words is sometimes limited, and this is not only for security reasons. It can happen that you think twice before speaking because what you say risks looking as if you are giving a lesson, because it can't be put into practice, especially where others would be exposing themselves publicly, whereas you can't. So you prefer to keep quiet unless you find a new form of complicity in a common project. After all, you are even freer to act because you have an advantage over the enemy. The latter doesn't know where you are. A form of punishment is adopted in some still existent primitive communities, which they consider the hardest. It is not physical torture, nor imprisonment or ostracism. When someone commits particularly serious and blameworthy acts, the community react by treating him as if he didn't exist. As they don't look at him, speak to him, or about him, the members of the community make him invisible for a length of time. They say it is an unbearable punishment. Our individuality is built up and completed by a continuous game of communication and reciprocal recognition. We are invisible to one another when we each feel guilty by our very presence, rendered awkward and anonymous by the homologation that prevents us from establishing our unions and talking sincerely without mediation. This is very similar to the condition experienced by millions of clandestine people in the world, mainly the economic refugees of the capitalist massacre. They are invisible and compelled to run like shadows along the walls of metropoli to expiate the guilt of being poor and foreign. Clandestine people frighten us because, through them, we perceive our condition as precarious, uprooted people, submitted to a gigantic, productive, and technological apparatus beyond our control and shunted from one material need to another, the meaning of which quite escapes us. I'm glad that this booklet also exposes the experience of someone living in hiding for reasons other than those of many comrades. This doesn't mean that we have to eliminate differences, but that we have to formulate a radical critique of borders and identity papers from a social point of view. Unfortunately, the idea of subverting the categories of dominion, worker or unemployed, citizen or foreigner, legal or illegal, innocent or guilty, was our idea in the first place, and not a real trend. Categories must be destroyed in the struggle. It's not enough to simply claim that they don't exist. The condition of millions of legally non-existent men and women, as a well-known, servile Italian political scientist called them, could be a painful yet formidable occasion to destroy all collective and authoritarian identities. Those who are invisible because they have been deprived of words and relationships often look for some collective identity as a form of defense. This is why fundamentalism exists, a speculative product of capital's negation of differences. A discussion on its social causes is urgent, as it is certainly not with intellectual argumentations on the inexistence of God that it is possible to formulate a practical critique of religion. The need for communities in a world where the only community is that of consumer goods is getting stronger and stronger and is easily manipulated by nationalistic and fundamentalist scourges. The invisible people who are surrounded by hatred and indifference, women and men who are faced with an ultimatum, are more and more numerous. They are either subjected and forced to integrate or deported. Common grounds for rebellion, created from immediate needs in order to go forward, are far more than solidarity. Our very freedom is at stake because the possibility of social war is very likely to be transformed into the certainty of racial war. It is in the overwhelming chaos of languages and cultures that new desertions and unions need to be experienced. How is it possible to be invisible to power and its guardians? In other words, how is it possible to defy identification, and at the same time be socially visible. I think this is the main problem that regards all clandestine comrades. I also think that we can begin to talk about our wanderer comrades starting from the condition of wandering on a large scale, so that our comrades are less distant.